Most organizations treat governance as a gate, a checkpoint, something you pass through before progress can continue. You run an audit, you find problems, you stop. That's the instinct. The LinkedIn case study I want to examine today is perfect for understanding why that instinct fails. An organization discovered 847 orphaned SharePoint sites, zero data classification, and a C-suite commitment to Copilot that wasn't moving. The governance team's reaction was immediate and predictable. Stop, we need to fix this first. But that reaction reveals something deeper, a foundational misunderstanding about how collaboration systems actually evolve. This episode is about what happens when you stop treating governance as a gate and start treating it as the track the deployment runs on. How you move from not ready to ready enough by sequencing risk intelligently instead of waiting for perfect conditions that will never arrive. The foundational misunderstanding: organic growth versus architectural intent. SharePoint and Teams environments don't grow according to architectural plans. They grow organically. This is not a feature of the system. It's a consequence of how work actually happens. A project starts, someone creates a site, people collaborate, documents accumulate, the project ends, the people move on. The site remains. Months later, the site's owner leaves the organization. Nobody transfers ownership. The site is now orphaned. But it still exists. It still holds documents. It still occupies storage. Multiply this across years, across hundreds of projects, across thousands of users with the ability to create. You get what the case study showed: 847 sites. No documentation, no clear ownership, no life cycle. Most organizations assume this indicates a broken system, that something went wrong. It didn't. What it indicates is that the system was never designed to manage its own evolution. Nobody built detection mechanisms. Nobody built remediation workflows. Nobody created policies that enforce accountability over time. The 847 sites weren't created recklessly. They were created through normal business processes. Projects, initiatives, temporary collaborations, then abandonment. This is the distinction that matters. Orphan sites are not evidence of a governance failure. They're evidence that governance systems were never architected to detect and remediate orphaned assets in real time. Many governance teams conflate two very different problems. The first is the existence of disorder. Sites exist without owners. Data exists without labels. Access permissions are overly broad. The second is the ability to manage disorder. Can you detect it? Can you remediate it? Can you enforce policy continuously? Organizations often assume these are the same problem. Their not disorder is inevitable. It emerges naturally from distributed work. Thousands of people making independent decisions about where to store information. When they leave, that information remains. The sites remain. The permissions remain. What matters is not whether disorder exists. What matters is whether you have mechanisms to detect, classify, and remediate it at scale. This is where most governance programs fail. They assume disorder shouldn't exist, so they focus on prevention. Don't create sites, don't create teams, don't store data without approval. This approach trades flexibility for control, and in the era of distributed work, it's a losing trade. The organization that created 847 orphan sites didn't do so through negligence. They did it through normal operations, because sites are easy to create, because collaboration requires flexibility, because approval processes get in the way. The question isn't how to prevent sites. Sites will be created. The question is how to manage them once they exist. Can you automatically detect inactive sites? Yes. SharePoint Advanced Management provides this. Can you automatically assign temporary ownership when ownership gaps appear? Yes, SAM policies can do this. Can you automatically classify data without depending on user behavior? Yes. Microsoft Purview auto-labeling makes this possible. Can you enforce these mechanisms continuously while deployment proceeds? Yes. This is exactly what parallel governance does. The 847 orphan sites weren't a problem because they existed. They were a governance opportunity because mechanisms didn't exist to detect and manage them. Once those mechanisms are in place, the number of orphan sites becomes less important than the speed and consistency with which they are detected and remediated. This is the shift from reactive to deterministic governance, and it's the foundation for everything that follows. The architecture of chaos: why 847 sites went unmanaged. Understanding how you arrive at 847 orphaned sites requires understanding how SharePoint actually behaves over time, not how it's designed to behave, how it actually behaves. Year 1, a few sites are created. A pilot project, a department collaboration space. The work is active, the sites are used, ownership is clear. Year 2, new sites appear. Different teams, different initiatives, still manageable, still visible. IT still knows what exists. Year 3, dozens of sites, maybe hundreds. New projects launch constantly. Some finish, some don't, some transform into something else. The documentation lags. Ownership lists become incomplete. Year 4, it becomes difficult to enumerate what exists. Sites are created via Teams provisioning. Shared channels auto-create supporting sites. Sites get created for projects that never launch, for initiatives that get cancelled, for temporary working groups that become permanent and then abandoned. By year 5, nobody knows how many sites exist. Nobody knows which ones are active. And critically, Nobody has a process to detect when ownership disappears. This is how you get to 847. Here's the architectural problem that makes this inevitable. SharePoint permissions are hierarchical and inherited. When a site is created, it has owners. Those owners manage the site. Their account contains the access rights. But access rights are tied to identity. When that person leaves the organization, their account gets disabled. The site doesn't disappear. The documents don't disappear. The permissions don't magically revert. The site simply has no active owners. It's orphaned. Without automated detection, this state is invisible. The site still exists in your tenant. It still occupies storage. It still appears in search results, but nobody is managing it. Nobody reviews permissions. Nobody certifies the content is valuable. This invisibility persists until something forces visibility. Usually a compliance audit or a Copilot readiness assessment. And here's where it compounds. Microsoft Graph indexes everything. Copilot's grounding mechanism pulls context from sites that users can access. Inherited permissions mean that even orphaned sites might be accessible to broad user groups. So Copilot surfaces content from orphaned sites, unless those sites are explicitly excluded, unless they're remediated. Each unmanaged site represents 3 separate risks. First, data exposure. Content exists without active governance. Second, compliance risk. Retention policies might not enforce. Sensitive data might not be classified. Third, operational friction. When Copilot surfaces information from an orphaned site, users get confused. Content might be outdated. Context might be lost. The case study organization had no SharePoint Advanced Management policies, no automated lifecycle detection, no mechanisms to assign interim ownership when original owners departed, no continuous monitoring, no enforcement. Instead, they had manual processes. Someone occasionally tried to clean up, someone checked ownership. But without scale, without automation, without policy, this work was sporadic and incomplete. What's critical, this organization isn't unique. Most organizations operate exactly this way. They rely on manual reviews. Periodic audits, hope that governance doesn't break. That works fine until you deploy something requiring clean data. Then you hit the wall. Suddenly governance becomes visible. Suddenly you ask, how many sites do we have? Which ones are owned? Which ones have classified data? The discovery of 847 orphaned sites felt like a crisis. The governance team wanted to stop, remediate first, deploy later. But there's a different interpretation of that discovery. Those 847 sites were always orphaned. The organization simply didn't know it. Visibility was the first victory. Visibility precedes control. Once you can see the problem, you build mechanisms to manage it. That's the shift from chaos to architecture and the false choice. Pause versus proceed. When governance teams discover 847 orphaned sites, the response is almost always the same. It's binary. Pause the Copilot rollout. Stop everything. We need to fix this first. This response is understandable. You've just learned your tenant is messier than you thought. The instinct to clean before you deploy makes intuitive sense, but it's architecturally wrong. The response treats governance as a gate, a checkpoint you must pass before progress continues. And it assumes something that isn't true, that perfect governance must precede deployment. This assumption fails in practice. Deployment pressure actually accelerates governance improvements, not slows them. When an organization commits to rolling out Copilot, governance suddenly becomes urgent. Teams that would have deferred remediation for months prioritize it in weeks. The business case becomes visible, the deadline becomes real, and the work gets done. Without that pressure, governance drifts. Remediation gets deferred. The organization continues to operate without the controls that deployment would have forced them to implement. Think about the cost structure here. Microsoft's research suggests Copilot delivers approximately $3.70 of productivity gain for every dollar invested. Whether that holds for your organization is less important than the principle. Delay means deferred value. When you pause Copilot rollout to remediate governance, you defer that productivity gain. 1 month of delay costs roughly $1.8 million in deferred value for a P200 person organization. 6 months cost $10.8 million. But there's a second cost that's less visible: governance debt. The longer the remediation phase continues, the more new orphaned sites are created. More collaboration happens without proper governance. More data is stored without classification. More access permissions accumulate. You're not fixing a static problem while the deployment waits. The problem is growing while you're trying to fix it. This creates a paradox. The longer you wait to deploy, the more governance issues you create. The organization continues to be operated without the controls that Copilot deployment would force them to establish. So the real cost of pause isn't fixing orphaned sites. The real cost is deferred productivity plus compounding governance debt. You're trading current value for a future state that never quite arrives. There's a third option: parallel track remediation. Fix the foundation while maintaining deployment velocity. Run governance improvements in parallel with Copilot rollout, not before it. This approach requires accepting one uncomfortable truth. Governance doesn't have to be perfect before deployment begins. It has to be managed intelligently during deployment. Perfect governance is impossible. You'll never eliminate all orphaned sites, all misclassified data, all access anomalies. But you can build mechanisms that detect and remediate continuously. You can enforce policy deterministically. You can improve the security posture in real time while value flows. This is where the distinction between a gate and a track becomes operational. A gate says you must reach a state of completion before proceeding. A track says you must have systems in place to manage the journey. The case study organization faced this exact decision point. Their governance team saw 847 orphaned sites and wanted to pause. The leadership saw Copilot's potential and wanted to proceed. Neither path alone was right, so they chose a third. They split the work into two simultaneous tracks. Track 1 would handle rapid triage, scan all sites, classify sensitive data, assign interim ownership, use automation to move as fast as possible. Track 2 would handle scope deployment, enable Copilot for the teams with the cleanest data posture, prove ROI, build momentum, expand as governance improved. The two tracks would move in parallel. Governance would improve during deployment, not before it. And that parallel motion would accelerate both. Track 1. Rapid triage using Purview and automated ownership. The first track focused on one objective: surface and classify high-risk content at scale. Not everything, just the content that Copilot would realistically surface in user queries. The mechanism was Microsoft Purview, specifically sensitive information types. SIT's Purview can identify credit card numbers, bank account details, financial data, personally identifiable information. The patterns are well defined, the detection is reliable. The organization ran automated scans across all 847 sites, not a manual inspection, not a sampling, all of them, in parallel. Here's what happened. Purview scanned, Purview classified. Assets were tagged with sensitivity levels in real time. Within 72 hours, the organization had visibility into which sites contained sensitive data and where. This is critical. That speed was not incidental, it was essential. 72 hours is the window before governance teams lose momentum. After 3 days, the project feels real. After a month, it feels theoretical again. The case study organization understood this. They kept the pace aggressive. Concurrent with the scans, they assigned interim site ownership. And this is where SharePoint Advanced Management became the force multiplier. SAM policies automatically detect sites lacking minimum owners. The best practice is 2. One owner is a single point of failure. If that person leaves, the site orphans again. 2 owners create redundancy. SAM doesn't require human intervention. It identifies non-compliant sites, and it assigns temporary administrators from a designated pool. Those administrators weren't permanent, they were interim. The policy explicitly stated this in the notification emails. These are temporary assignments. Your role is to identify the real owner, find them, document them, then step aside. This framing matters. It's not theft of ownership, it's stewardship. Someone needs to be responsible while permanent ownership is being recovered. The notifications went out systematically. Site members received emails, interim owners received emails. The process was transparent. Within 2 weeks, something remarkable happened. 94% of the 847 sites had documented owners, and sensitivity labels were applied to the content, 94% in 14 days. This velocity surprised almost everyone. IT leadership, security teams, the governance folks who had assumed this work would take months, but it makes sense once you understand the mechanism. Automation removes the bottleneck. You don't wait for humans to make decisions. The system detects violations. The system assigns remediation. The system notifies stakeholders. Humans respond to notifications, not to abstract requests. Humans are slow at making proactive decisions in abstract contexts, but humans are fast at responding to specific directives. You are now the interim owner of this site. Please confirm ownership or identify the real owner. People respond to that. The classification happened the same way. Purview didn't ask users to label their data. Purview scanned for patterns. Purview applied labels based on what it detected. Credit card numbers, confidential label. Bank account numbers, confidential label. Social security numbers, confidential label. These decisions are deterministic, not probabilistic. The system doesn't hope users will classify correctly. The system enforces classification automatically. One detail is worth emphasizing. The organization didn't achieve perfect classification in 2 weeks. They achieved 94% remediation. That means 6% of sites still lacked documented owners. 6% of content still lacked sensitivity labels. This was acceptable. Not because imperfection is good, but because the mechanism was now in place to continuously detect and remediate the remaining 6%. The governance system was operational, it was detecting violations, it was enforcing policy, and it was doing this while deployment prepared to proceed. This is the distinction between perfect and ready enough. Perfect would mean no orphaned sites exist anywhere. No data lacks classification. Every permission is exactly right. Ready enough means you have systems in place to detect and remediate violations continuously. You have automated mechanisms. You have policy enforcement. You have visibility. The organization had moved from invisible chaos to visible, managed chaos. And that shift from invisible to visible was the prerequisite for everything that followed. understanding sensitivity labels and auto-labeling. Sensitivity labels are not just metadata tags. That's the first misconception to discard. They are enforcement mechanisms. They control encryption, they control access, they control downstream policy application. When a document gets a sensitivity label, things actually happen. The document gets encrypted differently. Sharing restrictions activate, DLP policies trigger, retention policies enforce. This is not about organization, this is about architecture. Most organizations assume that sensitivity labels are something users apply, that someone creates a document and consciously chooses a classification: public, internal, confidential, highly confidential. This approach fails at scale, almost universally. Adoption rates for manual labeling typically remain below 10%. Not because users are negligent, because classification is not their primary task. Their task is to write the document, to solve the problem, to move forward. Classification feels like friction, so most documents never get classified. They exist in a liminal state. Technically, they have a default label. In practice, they're unclassified. This breaks downstream controls. DLP policies can't protect what they don't know about. Retention policies can't archive what they can't identify. Copilot can't respect access controls that don't exist. The solution is to reverse the assumption. Instead of asking users to classify, you build systems that classify automatically. Microsoft Purview supports multiple auto-labeling mechanisms. They're not sophisticated. They're not trying to understand context the way a human would. They're pattern matching engines. Exact data match looks for specific values. A credit card number matches a pattern. A bank account number matches. A social security number matches. The system finds these patterns and applies a label automatically. Pattern matching via regular expressions works similarly but more flexibly. You define a pattern. The system scans for matches. When it finds them, it labels. Trainable classifiers use machine learning. You give the system examples of what you want to classify. Financial documents, proprietary documents, strategic plans. The system learns, it generalizes, it classifies new documents based on what it learned. In the case study, the organization configured auto-labeling rules systematically. Credit card numbers triggered a confidential label. Bank account numbers triggered confidential. Swift codes triggered confidential. Social security numbers triggered confidential. Passport numbers triggered confidential. They also configured proprietary data. Internal naming patterns. When documents matched those patterns, they got a highly confidential label. This required some tuning. The organization had to think about what proprietary meant. What patterns indicated proprietary information. Once defined, the system enforced it automatically. Once labels are applied, the entire downstream architecture activates. DLP policies see the label. If a document labeled highly confidential is about to be shared externally, DLP blocks it, or warns, or logs it, depending on configuration. Retention policies see the label. Documents labeled financial data might have a retention requirement. After X years, archive them. After Y years, delete them. The label triggers the policy. Copilot sees the label. If a user prompts Copilot and Copilot would normally surface a highly confidential document from an unauthorized source, the label blocks it. Access controls enforced by the label restrict what Copilot can retrieve. This is how you move from theoretical governance to operational governance. The critical insight is this: classification does not have to be complete before deployment begins. It has to be systematic, it has to be continuous, but it does not have to be perfect from day one. As new documents are created, auto-labeling applies labels automatically. The organization gradually improves its classification posture over time, without requiring a massive upfront project, without waiting for users to become classification conscious. Every document written from that point forward gets classified. Older documents get classified as they're accessed or modified. The classification backlog shrinks continuously. This is why the case study organization could achieve 94% remediation in 2 weeks, then maintain momentum while deployment proceeded. The classification mechanism was operational, systematic, continuous, and it required no human intervention beyond the initial configuration. The governance system was now enforcing policy, not hoping users would comply. Track 2. Scoped deployment in clean zones. While Track 1 was running in the background, quietly remediating and classifying, Track 2 was building momentum where conditions were already favorable. The organization did not wait for full remediation to begin Copilot deployment. They rolled it out to 3 business units immediately: finance, legal, human resources. These 3 units were selected deliberately, not randomly, not based on who asked first, based on governance maturity. Finance had higher baseline governance. They deal with regulated data constantly. Financial systems, regulatory compliance. These teams already used sensitivity labels. Their data was reasonably well organized. Their ownership structures were clearer. Legal operated similarly. Sensitive documents, privilege concerns, established processes for document classification. They understood what confidentiality meant. They enforced it rigorously. Human resources managed personnel data, also regulated, also classified, also accustomed to access controls and retention requirements. These 3 units did not represent the entire organization. They represented approximately 200 users, roughly 10% of the total employee base. But here's what matters. They were the 10% with the highest value roles, roles where Copilot productivity gains would be most visible. Report generation, legal analysis, policy research, contract review, HR policy synthesis, email drafting, communications. These are the tasks Copilot accelerates most visibly. The pilot was not delayed by the broader governance issues, not postponed until 847 orphan sites were fully remediated, not waiting for 100% classification adoption across the organization. It proceeded immediately, in parallel with track 1. This parallelism is counterintuitive. Most organizations believe deployment should follow governance improvement, establish controls first, then deploy technology. But the case study organization understood something that architecture reveals. Governance improves faster when deployment pressure exists. When you announce Copilot is coming, suddenly governance becomes real, not theoretical, real. Teams that would have deferred remediation for months prioritize it in weeks. The business case becomes visible. The deadline is concrete. When IT leadership sees Copilot delivering measurable value, they become motivated to extend governance controls to enable broader rollout, not to prevent rollout, to enable it. This is not manipulation of process. This is alignment of incentives. The technology creates urgency. The urgency drives governance work. The governance work enables safer expansion. Within 4 weeks, the pilot units generated measurable outcomes, 26 minutes of daily time savings per user, quantified, measured against baselines, not aspirational. Actual report generation accelerated, email drafting accelerated, information synthesis became faster. Users spent less time searching for context. Copilot provided it. Users spent less time formatting output. Copilot handled it. Users spent less time waiting for approvals on routine communications. Visible productivity gains in high-value roles in controlled environments. These metrics became the business case, not for pilots, for expansion. When CFOs see that you're recovering 26 minutes per day for highly compensated employees, the math becomes obvious. 4 weeks of productive recovery pays for a year of Copilot licensing. The ROI becomes undeniable. This is where momentum matters architecturally. The pilots proved concept. The metrics justified expansion. The governance controls enabled safe scaling. By week 6, Copilot was live for 200 users across 3 business units. By week 10, track 1 had completed its work. 94% of previously orphaned sites had documented ownership. Sensitivity labels were applied to classified content. The governance mechanisms were operational. The 2 tracks had moved in parallel. Neither delayed the other. Both reinforced the other. Track 1 improved the foundation. Track 2 proved the value. Together, they created momentum that accelerated both. This is what parallel track governance actually looks like in practice. Not sequential, synchronized, iterative. Pressure from deployment accelerates governance work. Success from governance enables faster deployment. The 2 feed each other. The organization had converted a governance crisis into a governance acceleration. The synthesis: how deployment pressure accelerates governance. The conventional wisdom in IT leadership is almost universally wrong on this point. The conventional wisdom says governance improvements must precede deployment. Establish controls, enforce compliance, reach a state of readiness, then deploy new technology. The case study demonstrated something different. The opposite, actually. Governance improvements happened faster because deployment pressure existed, not in spite of the pressure, because of it. This is counterintuitive, but it's architecturally inevitable. When an organization commits to a Copilot rollout, governance suddenly becomes urgent. Not theoretical, not aspirational, urgent. Teams that would have deferred remediation work for months prioritize it in weeks. The business case becomes visible, the deadline becomes real, and the work gets done. Think about the governance team's perspective. Normally, they're asking for time and resources to fix long-standing issues. Orphaned sites, unclassified data, oversharing. These problems have existed for years. Why fix them now? The organization has been operating this way indefinitely. But introduce Copilot. Suddenly there's a deadline. There's executive visibility. There's a metric that matters. Can we deploy safely or not? Governance becomes a business enabler instead of a compliance constraint. This alignment is powerful. The same work that was deferred for years because it felt like maintenance becomes urgent because it enables innovation. The governance team isn't asking for resources to catch up on backlog. They're asking for resources to accelerate Copilot readiness. And that request gets granted. The case study organization understood this instinctively. Their governance team didn't propose a 6-month remediation phase before deployment. They proposed parallel tracks. Improve governance while deploying. Let the 2 reinforce each other. And that's exactly what happened. Track 1 ran in the background, scanning, classifying, assigning ownership, applying policies. Every week, the governance metrics improved. More sites had documented owners. More content had sensitivity labels. More policies were in place to enforce controls continuously. Track 2 moved forward, pilots, metrics, expansion, visible value. But here's what's critical architecturally. Track 1 was not waiting for Track 2, and Track 2 was not delayed by Track 1. The 2 moved in parallel, and they reinforced each other. Week 1. Track 2 pilots launched to 3 business units. Track 1 began scanning the full tenant. Nothing blocked the other. Week 2, Track 2 was measuring adoption and productivity gains. Track 1 was completing initial classification. The scans identified 847 orphaned sites. The discovery felt urgent, not paralyzing, because pilots were already running. The organization had forward momentum. Week 3, Track 2 released metrics. 26 minutes per day, measurable, visible. This became the business case for expansion. Meanwhile, Track 1 was assigning interim ownership to non-compliant sites. 94% remediation within 2 weeks. Week 4, momentum. Business units wanted Copilot. Leadership saw ROI. Governance teams saw their work accelerating the rollout, not delaying it. Week 10, Track 2 had expanded to additional business units. Copilot was live for thousands of users. Track 1 had completed remediation. Governance improved measurably across the tenant. The organization had achieved something most organizations can't. They improved governance while deploying new technology, not after. This is only possible when governance and deployment are aligned. When governance enables deployment instead of blocking it, urgency accelerates the work. When IT leaders see Copilot delivering value, they become motivated to extend governance controls to enable broader rollout, not to constrain rollout, to accelerate it. This is the synthesis. Deployment pressure accelerates governance. Governance improvements enable safer deployment. The two feed each other. They're not sequential, they're synchronized. The organization moved from not ready to ready enough, not by waiting for perfect conditions, but by moving forward while building the conditions for safe progress. Every governance improvement unlocked more deployment. Every successful deployment created urgency for more governance. The two move together. This is how you convert governance from a gate that stops progress into a track that enables it. The metrics that matter: remediation rate, triage speed, and ROI. 3 metrics convinced skeptical IT leaders that parallel governance was the right approach. Not arguments, not architectural philosophy. Metrics, numbers that aligned with how leadership thinks about money and time and risk. Remediation rate, the first metric, surprised almost everyone. 94% of orphaned sites had documented owners and sensitivity labels within 10 weeks. This outcome shocked people who believed remediation required months, maybe a year. Some organizations run these projects for 18 months before declaring success. Not this one, 94% in 10 weeks. The distinction is important. Without deployment pressure, similar remediation rates typically require 6 to 12 months. Manual processes, humans inspecting lists, humans sending notifications, humans following up, humans categorizing. The work proceeds at human pace. With deployment pressure, that timeline compresses dramatically. Same work, same problem, completely different velocity. Urgency becomes a catalyst. Suddenly, the governance team's remediation work is not maintenance. It's enablement. It's unblocking Copilot. It gets resourced accordingly. It gets prioritized accordingly. It gets done accordingly. The organization had accelerated remediation by a factor of approximately 6. That's not incremental improvement. That's a fundamental shift in how the work is done. SharePoint Advanced Management policies automated much of this. You don't wait for humans to decide. The policy detects violations. The policy notifies owners. The policy assigns interim stewards. Humans respond to notifications. They provide information. They confirm decisions. The system enforces compliance. Automation removes the bottleneck. Human judgment doesn't. Automation does the systematic work. Humans make the judgment calls. When you structure it that way, velocity increases dramatically. Time to triage. The second metric was speed in a different dimension. Initial risk assessment for all 847 sites completed in 72 hours. 3 days. Not 3 months, not 3 weeks. 3 days to visibility on the entire estate. This was only possible because the organization used automated scanning tools. Purview ran across 847 sites in parallel. Purview identified sensitive data. Purview applied classifications, all simultaneously, not sequentially, not human inspection-based. Manual approaches would have taken months. You'd need to inspect each site, review documents, make classification judgments, document findings, build reports. Weeks of work for a team of people. Instead, machines scanned, machines classified, machines reported. In 72 hours, the organization had visibility into which sites contained what data and which needed remediation. This visibility is the prerequisite for management. You can't manage what you can't see. 72 hours transformed this organization from invisible chaos to visible, measurable risk. Once triage was complete, decision-making became possible. The organization could prioritize. Which sites contained the most sensitive data? Which had the broadest access? Which posed the highest compliance risk? These questions had answers now, based on data, based on scans, based on automated analysis. That's how you move from reactive to strategic governance. ROI signal. The third metric connected governance to business value. This is where leadership actually pays attention. Microsoft research suggests Copilot delivers approximately $3.70 of productivity value for every dollar invested. Whether that exact ratio holds for your organization is less important than the principle. Copilot creates measurable value. The case study organization measured this directly in their pilot. 26 minutes of daily time savings per user. At $75 per hour, fully loaded labor cost, that's $18,000 in annual productivity value per user. For 200 pilot users, That's $21.6 million in annual productivity gains. Copilot licensing costs $30 per user per month. The ROI becomes visible within the first month of deployment. Now reverse it. Delaying deployment delays these gains. Every month of delay costs approximately $1.8 million in deferred productivity value for a done 200-person organization. These metrics shifted the entire conversation. The question stopped being, is governance perfect? It became, are we capturing value while improving governance? That's how you move an organization forward. SharePoint Advanced Management, the automation layer. SharePoint Advanced Management is not optional infrastructure for organizations pursuing parallel governance. It is the foundation. Everything else builds on it. Without SAM, you're attempting to manage governance through manual processes. Human inspection, human notification, human follow-up, human escalation. This approach does not scale, not to 847 sites, not to thousands, not to tens of thousands. SAM removes humans from the repetitive work and lets them focus on judgment calls. SAM provides several critical capabilities that make the parallel track approach architecturally feasible. They're not flashy, they're not innovative, but they're relentlessly operational. Site lifecycle policies. These automatically detect inactive sites and enforce expiration rules. You define inactivity, 90 days without modification, 180 days without a visit. You choose. Once defined, SAM scans continuously. Sites that exceed the inactivity threshold trigger notifications, not once, monthly for 3 months. The owner receives email. This site appears inactive, certify its continued value or it will be archived. Most owners respond, some ignore it. After 3 months of non-response, the policy enforces the action. Read-only mode, the site stops accepting changes, or it gets archived entirely, moved to lower-cost storage via Microsoft 365 Archive. This is deterministic governance, not probabilistic, not dependent on someone remembering to check. The policy runs, the policy notifies, the policy enforces. Humans respond to notifications. They make the judgment. The system executes ownership policies. These ensure every site has accountable administrators. And this is where the automation matters most in the case study. The organization configured ownership policies to require minimum 2 owners per site. Redundancy: if one owner leaves, the site doesn't orphan. SAM automatically detects sites failing this requirement. Monthly scan: sites with fewer than 2 owners get flagged. Notifications go out not to generic IT mailboxes, to specific stakeholders: site members, interim administrators, managers. The notification is specific. This site currently lacks required ownership. Please identify an owner. Please document them. Please confirm. Not fix your governance. Specific directives. Within SAM's architecture, the system can even assign interim administrators automatically. Not permanent, explicitly interim, from a designated pool, people who volunteered for this role, who understand it's temporary, whose job is to stabilize the site, not own it forever. This removes the paralysis. Someone owns the site immediately. Not eventually, now. That interim owner stabilizes the situation, identifies the real owner, documents them, escalates, then steps aside. Restricted access control. This limits Copilot indexing scope for sensitive environments. Once a site is remediated, you can control whether Copilot surfaces its content. Not all sites need to be Copilot visible. Some contain legacy data, some contain experimental content, some contain vendor information that shouldn't flow through an AI system. SAM policies let you exclude specific sites from Copilot's scope. Not by manual list, by policy, by sensitivity label, by retention status, deterministically, site access reviews. These ensure permissions remain appropriate over time. Not once, continuously. Owners receive notifications on a schedule, quarterly, annually. Review who has access. Confirm these permissions are still needed, remove who shouldn't be here. These are not optional, policies enforce them. Non-response triggers escalation. In the case study, the organization configured all 4 capabilities simultaneously. The policies ran monthly. They identified non-compliant sites. They sent notifications. They assigned interim stewards. They generated reports showing exactly which sites required action. Here's the operational detail. SAM policies are not free. They require SharePoint Advanced Management licensing, typically $3 to $5 per user per month. But compare that cost to manual governance. Someone reviewing 847 sites manually. Someone sending notifications, someone following up on non-responses, someone escalating, someone documenting. That human cost exceeds SAM licensing by a factor of 10 or more. SAM pays for itself immediately through labor elimination alone. The case study organization understood this. They invested in SAM. They configured policies comprehensively. They let the automation run. And that automation was the force multiplier that made 94% remediation in 10 weeks possible. Without SAM, those 847 sites would still be unmanaged. Because humans can't inspect 847 sites efficiently, machines can. Purview provides the data protection layer. SAM provides the governance automation layer. Together, they create the foundation for parallel governance to work. Microsoft Purview, the data protection layer. Microsoft Purview provides the classification and protection mechanisms that enable safe Copilot deployment. If SAM is the governance automation layer, Purview is the data protection layer. The two are complementary. Without both, parallel governance fails. Purview addresses a problem that SAM doesn't solve: what data exists, where it is, and what protection it requires. SAM ensures sites have owners. Purview ensures data is classified. These are different problems requiring different solutions. Sensitivity labels form the foundation. They define classification levels: public, internal, confidential, highly confidential. Each level carries implications downstream. When a document receives a confidential label, encryption activates, access restrictions activate, DLP policies activate, retention policies activate, sharing restrictions activate. The label is not metadata. It is an enforcement mechanism. Auto-labeling policies are where the operational power resides. Instead of asking users to classify documents, you build policies that classify automatically. This removes the dependency on user behavior, which almost always fails at scale. Purview can identify credit card numbers via pattern matching, bank account numbers, SWIFT codes, social security numbers, passport numbers. The patterns are well defined. The detection is reliable. When Purview scans a document and detects credit card numbers, it applies a confidential label automatically. No human intervention required. The organization also configured pattern matching via regular expressions for proprietary data. Internal naming conventions, specific identifier formats. Once defined, Purview scanned continuously. When documents matched these patterns, they received a highly confidential label automatically. Data loss prevention policies work in conjunction with labels. DLP policies say, if a document with a highly confidential label is about to be shared externally, block it, or warn the user, or allow it with justification, or simply audit and log the action. You define the policy. Purview enforces it. In the case study, the organization configured DLP to block external sharing of highly confidential content entirely. No workarounds, no justifications. The boundary was firm. Insider risk management detects potentially risky behavior. Users downloading large amounts of sensitive data, users accessing confidential documents they normally don't interact with, users forwarding sensitive emails outside the organization. These actions trigger alerts. This is particularly important in Copilot environments. Copilot enables rapid synthesis and reuse of information. A user can query Copilot, and Copilot surfaces relevant documents from across the organization. The user can then copy that synthesis, combine it with other information, and share it widely. This speed creates risk. Insider risk management monitors these patterns. The case study organization's Purview configuration was systematic. They configured auto-labeling rules for financial data. Credit card numbers triggered confidential. Bank account numbers triggered confidential. SWIFT codes triggered confidential. They configured auto-labeling for personally identifiable information. Social security numbers triggered confidential. Passport numbers triggered confidential. They configured auto-labeling for proprietary information. Specific internal naming patterns triggered highly confidential. Trade secrets, strategic plans, competitive data. Once labeled, DLP policies enforced restrictions. Highly confidential content could not be shared externally. Period. Confidential content could be shared with approval. Audit policies logged all Copilot interactions involving confidential or highly confidential data. These policies were configured before Copilot deployment. They were not perfect. Some edge cases existed, some false positives occurred, some documents lacked classification initially, but the policies were sufficient to manage risk. And critically, they were systematic. As the organization learned how Copilot was being used, they refined policies. They identified patterns where classification had failed. They tightened rules. They expanded CITES. Governance improved continuously. This is the critical insight that separates parallel governance from the gate model. Perfect classification is not a prerequisite for deployment. Systematic classification is. You do not require 100% of data to be perfectly classified before enabling Copilot. You require mechanisms in place to classify data automatically, continuously, and deterministically. Purview's auto-labeling ensures new documents get classified automatically. No manual intervention, no user behavior dependency. Machines scan, machines classify, machines apply policies. Humans make judgment calls when policies require them. Over time, your classification posture improves, not because you launched a massive remediation project, but because every new document gets classified. Every document touched by DLP policies gets reviewed. Every interaction with Copilot gets logged and monitored. Governance is not a project, it is continuous. And that continuous operation is what enables safe deployment while progress continues. Addressing the security objection, Copilot does not bypass permissions. The most common objection that surfaces when governance teams encounter Copilot is immediate and visceral. Copilot will expose sensitive data. This concern is understandable. The organization has classified data, financial information, personnel records, trade secrets, strategic plans, and now they're about to enable an AI system that will synthesize information from across the entire Microsoft 365 estate. The fear is rational, but the concern is based on a misunderstanding of how Copilot actually works. Copilot does not bypass permissions. This is fundamental to understand. Copilot respects the same Microsoft Graph permission model used by every other Microsoft 365 application. If a user cannot access a document today, Copilot cannot retrieve it. This is enforced at the platform level, not at the application level. The graph permission check happens before Copilot ever sees the document. If the user lacks access, the document is invisible to Copilot. Period. This is not a feature unique to Copilot. Every application in Microsoft 365 works this way. Outlook does not show emails the user cannot access. SharePoint does not display files the user has no permission to view. Teams does not surface channels the user cannot join. Microsoft Graph enforces permissions uniformly across the platform. Copilot inherits these exact same restrictions. What Copilot does differently is surface information faster and synthesize it across sources. Instead of a user manually opening email, reading context, checking SharePoint, reviewing Teams messages, and synthesizing conclusions, Copilot does this in seconds. The information synthesis is faster, the scope is broader, but the permission boundaries remain unchanged. This is a critical distinction. Copilot does not create risk, it reveals existing risk posture. When a security team worries that Copilot will expose sensitive data, what they're actually worried about is that Copilot will surface data to users who shouldn't have access. But if those users don't have access today, Copilot can't surface it. If those users do have access today, then the risk already exists. The data already exists in those users' accessible locations. In SharePoint sites they can view, in Teams conversations they can read, in email threads they can access. Copilot doesn't move data outside those boundaries. It surfaces information within existing permission scopes. In the case study, the organization's security team initially resisted Copilot deployment due to precisely these concerns: data exposure, unintended synthesis, breaches. But here's what changed their perspective. As Track 1 improved governance, assigning owners to orphaned sites, classifying sensitive data, applying DLP policies, the security team could see governance actually improving, not degrading, not hypothetically at risk, actively improving. Sensitivity labels were being applied, access was being reviewed, permissions were being cleaned, and none of this happened in reaction to Copilot concerns. It happened because the governance infrastructure existed to enforce it. The security team moved from Copilot is a risk to Copilot is a governance accelerator, because Copilot forces organizations to confront governance weaknesses. When you enable Copilot, you suddenly care about where sensitive data lives. You suddenly care about who can access it. You suddenly care about oversharing. These problems existed before Copilot, but Copilot makes them visible and urgent. Organizations that would have tolerated permission drift for years suddenly prioritize it, because Copilot will surface that drift, because executives understand that Copilot's value depends on clean data. This exposure is not a vulnerability, it's an opportunity. The parallel track approach leverages this. Deploy governance controls, enable Copilot in clean zones, let both improve together. Let the urgency of Copilot deployment accelerate governance work. Let the success of governance improvements enable broader Copilot expansion. The case study organization understood this eventually. Their security team moved from blocking to enabling, not because Copilot became less risky, but because governance became more systematic, because the organization now had mechanisms to detect and remediate risk continuously, because they could see Copilot's value without accepting governance degradation. This is how you move security teams from no to yes. Not by proving Copilot is risk-free, it's not, no technology is, but by demonstrating that governance actually improves when you deploy with intention. The cost of waiting, deferred value and compounding debt. Organizations waiting for perfect governance before enabling Copilot are solving the wrong problem. They think the problem is data quality. They think the problem is classification completeness. They think the problem is ownership clarity. These are symptoms. The actual problem is opportunity cost. The real cost of delay is not fixing orphaned sites. The real cost is deferred productivity plus compounding governance debt. Two separate costs that move in opposite directions. Let's quantify the first one. The case study organization measured 26 minutes of daily time savings per user in their pilot. That's not hypothetical, that's what they observed. Across 1,200 users, in high-value roles. The math is straightforward. 26 minutes per day times approximately 250 working days per year equals approximately 108 hours per year per user. At $75 per hour fully loaded labor cost, that's $18,000 in annual productivity value per user. For 1,200 users, that's $21.6 million in annual productivity gains. Copilot licensing costs approximately $30 per user per month. For 1,200 users, that's $36,000 per month or $432,000 per year. The ROI becomes visible within the first month. By month 2, the organization has recovered the licensing cost. From that point forward, it's net value. Now reverse that timeline. An organization that chose to pause Copilot deployment for 6 months to remediate governance would have deferred all of those gains. 6 months of delay means no productivity improvement, no time savings, no value capture. 6 months of 1,200 users not receiving 26 minutes of daily productivity improvement equals $1.8 million per month in deferred value. For 6 months, that's $10.8 million in opportunity cost. This is not theoretical, this is not aspirational. This is the actual financial cost of choosing to pause and remediate before deploying. But there's a second cost that's less visible and more insidious: compounding governance debt. The longer an organization operates without automated governance controls, the worse governance becomes. Not stays the same, becomes worse. Every month without SAM policies, additional orphaned sites are created. Projects launch, temporary teams form. Collaboration spaces emerge. Site creation continues at normal velocity. But SAM is not there to detect inactivity or enforce ownership, so the orphaned sites accumulate. Every month without Purview auto-labeling, additional data goes unclassified, documents are written, data is stored, and nobody is enforcing classification policy, so the unclassified data accumulates. Every month without DLP policies enforcing access controls, additional permission drift occurs. Users gain access to resources, they change teams. Their access lingers, they leave the organization entirely. Their access remains. Permissions become increasingly misaligned with current need. This is entropy in the architectural sense, not chaos that stands still, chaos that compounds. By the time an organization finishes a 6-month remediation phase and is ready to deploy Copilot, the governance environment has deteriorated further. The organization now has not 847 orphaned sites. It has 1,200, not 90% unclassified data. It has 95%. Not minor permission drift, it has major permission sprawl. The problem you were trying to solve 6 months ago has become substantially worse. This is the paradox of waiting. The longer you wait to improve governance, the worse governance becomes. The parallel track approach breaks this paradox entirely. You improve governance while deploying. You don't choose between governance and productivity. You achieve both simultaneously. The governance work doesn't get deferred. It runs in parallel. The productivity value doesn't get delayed. It flows immediately. The case study organization understood this instinctively. They did not pause. They did not remediate first. They deployed while remediating. They captured value from day one. They improved governance continuously. And they moved from not ready to ready enough in 10 weeks instead of 6 months. The organization that chose the pause approach would have been $10.8 million poorer and in worse governance shape when they finally deployed. That cost differential is not incidental. It's structural. It's the cost of choosing a gate instead of a track. Governance as track, not gate, the architectural principle. The core principle of parallel governance is simple but transformative. Governance is not a gate. Governance is the track the deployment runs on. This distinction matters architecturally because it changes everything about how you structure the work. A gate is a checkpoint, a threshold, a boundary. You must reach this state before you can proceed to the next state. You must pass through the gate. Until you do, progress stops. This is how most organizations treat readiness assessments. They check off boxes. Does the organization have MFA? Check. Does the organization have DLP policies? Check. Does the organization have sensitivity labels? Check. Does the organization have site lifecycle policies? Check. Once all boxes are marked complete, the organization passes through the gate. Copilot deployment can begin. This approach assumes something that's never true. That perfect governance is possible before deployment. It is not. Governance is never perfect. It is never complete. It never reaches a final state where all conditions are optimal and all risks are eliminated. That state does not exist in operating systems. It does not exist in infrastructure. It does not exist in organizations. Imperfection is not a failure mode. It is the natural state of complex systems. What matters is whether those systems have mechanisms to detect and remediate imperfection continuously. The parallel track model accepts that governance will be imperfect. It focuses instead on making governance systematic and continuous. SAM policies and Purview classification are not gates. They are tracks. The deployment runs on those tracks. As Copilot is deployed to users, these governance systems operate continuously. They detect issues, they apply controls, they improve the security posture in real time. This is fundamentally different from the gate model, which would require all governance systems to be perfect before deployment begins. Here's the operational distinction. In the gate model, you run a readiness assessment. You identify gaps, you remediate gaps. Once all gaps are filled, you move forward. The assessment is a moment. The remediation is a project. The deployment is the next phase. In the track model, you deploy while improving. Governance systems run continuously. They detect new issues as they emerge. They remediate automatically. The assessment is not a moment. It is continuous. The remediation is not a project. It is operational. The deployment is not the next phase. It is happening now while governance improves. The case study organization implemented this principle by design, not accident. They ran automated governance scans continuously, monthly, weekly. These scans detected non-compliant sites. The scans triggered ownership policies. The policies assigned interim stewards. The governance system enforced compliance in real time. The organization didn't wait to fix everything and then deploy. They deployed while the fixes were happening. SAM policies and purview classification are the mechanical expression of this principle. SAM policies run deterministically. Every month, they detect sites failing ownership requirements. They send notifications. They assign interim administrators. They don't wait for humans to remember. The system enforces policy. Humans respond to enforcement. The work gets done. Purview classification works similarly. As documents are created or modified, auto-labeling applies labels automatically. Classification improves continuously, not because humans decide to classify, but because the system enforces classification policy. Every document that matches a pattern gets labeled. Over time, the classification posture improves. This is the distinction between a probabilistic governance model and a deterministic one. In a probabilistic model, governance might work or it might not, depending on user behavior and manual processes. Some users classify documents, others don't. Some owners manage their sites, others don't. Some access reviews occur on schedule, others get deferred. The outcome is uncertain. In a deterministic model, governance will work because it is enforced by policy, not by hoping users will do the right thing. Every site will have owners because SAM enforces it. Every document will be classified because Purview enforces it. Every access review will occur because policies enforce it. The parallel track approach shifts from probabilistic to deterministic governance. This shift requires investment, SAM licenses, Purview licenses, configuration work, but the investment eliminates uncertainty. When governance is deterministic, organizations can deploy with confidence. They know controls are in place. They know controls are being enforced. The case study organization made this investment. They paid for SAM. They paid for Purview auto-labeling. They configured both comprehensively. And they deployed while that infrastructure operated. This is how you move from viewing governance as a constraint on innovation to viewing governance as an enabler of innovation, not by eliminating governance, by making governance operational and continuous instead of episodic and gate-like. Deterministic versus probabilistic governance models. Most organizations operate with what might be called a probabilistic governance model. They don't call it that, but that's what it is. In a probabilistic governance model, governance controls exist, but they are not enforced uniformly. They depend on user behavior. They depend on manual processes. They depend on periodic audits that may or may not occur on schedule. The outcome is unpredictable. Some users apply sensitivity labels to their documents. Others don't. Some site owners actively manage their site's permissions. Others ignore the responsibility entirely. Some access reviews are completed when they're scheduled. Others get deferred month after month because there's no enforcement mechanism. The probability that governance will work depends on the accumulated sum of individual decisions made by thousands of people. When you have 5,000 users and governance depends on those users doing the right thing consistently, you're betting on something that never happens. Probability of compliance is not determinism, it is hope. And hope is not an architectural principle. As organizations scale, the probability of governance failure increases exponentially. You don't need all 5,000 users to fail. You need enough of them to fail that risk becomes unmanageable. And you will get enough failures. You will always get enough failures. This is why large organizations have continuous governance crises. It's not because people are incompetent. It's because the model is structurally broken. The model assumes humans will enforce governance consistently. Humans won't. Humans can't. Governance that depends on consistent human behavior at scale will fail. The parallel track approach shifts to what might be called a deterministic governance model. In a deterministic model, governance controls are enforced automatically through policy, not hopefully, not eventually, automatically. Every site is required to have minimum owners, not encouraged, not suggested, required. SAM policies enforce this. The policy runs. It detects sites with insufficient owners. It notifies stakeholders. It assigns interim stewards. It doesn't wait for humans to remember. It enforces the requirement. Every document is classified automatically, not by user choice, not by manual review. Automatically. Purview policies scan for patterns. When patterns match, labels apply. Every document written from that moment forward gets classified. Not some documents, all documents, deterministically. Every access review is triggered on schedule, not if an administrator remembers, not if resources permit, on schedule. The policy says owners certify their site's access every 90 days. The notification goes out on day 89. The policy enforces the requirement. The outcome is deterministic. Governance will work. Not because people are diligent, not because compliance culture is strong, because the system enforces it. The case study organization made this shift deliberately. They moved from hoping governance would happen to ensuring it would happen. From probabilistic to deterministic. This shift cost money, SAM licenses, Purview licensing, premium features, configuration work. It required investment. But the investment eliminated uncertainty. Once policies were in place, the organization knew sites would have owners. They knew data would be classified. They knew access would be reviewed, not hoped, knew. This is the architectural advantage that made parallel governance possible. When governance is probabilistic, you cannot deploy safely until you've addressed every known issue. You must fix the known problems because you cannot be certain the governance system will prevent new ones. You must pause deployment. You must remediate first. When governance is deterministic, you can deploy while improving. The governance system will detect new issues. The governance system will enforce controls. You do not need to fix everything in advance. You need to ensure the enforcement mechanisms are operational. And you can do that while deployment proceeds. The case study organization understood this instinctively. They invested in deterministic governance. They deployed while policies enforced compliance. And they moved faster than any probabilistic approach could have achieved. This is what architectural certainty enables. Not confidence. Certainty. Sequencing risk intelligently. Pilot, expand, operate. The parallel track approach is not a single deployment. It is a sequenced series of deployments. Each phase builds on the previous one. Each phase provides evidence that conditions support moving forward. This sequencing is not arbitrary. It is how you manage risk in a system where perfect conditions do not exist. The case study organization structured their deployment in 3 explicit phases. Phase 1, pilot, weeks 1 through 4. Deploy to 1,200 users in 3 business units. Finance, legal, human resources, these units had higher baseline governance maturity. They understood sensitive data. They had existing classification practices. They were not random choices. They were strategic. This phase serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It proves ROI. It identifies integration issues before scaling. It builds organizational momentum. It provides evidence that Copilot works in controlled environments. By the end of week 4, the organization had measurable outcomes. 26 minutes of daily time savings per user. Visible productivity gains in report generation, visible gains in email drafting, visible gains in legal document analysis. These metrics were not aspirational. They were observed. The pilot phase also revealed issues. What worked for finance might not work for other departments. Copilot integration challenges emerged. User training gaps appeared. Adoption patterns became visible. All of this was captured in a controlled environment. 3 business units, 1,400 users, manageable scope. Phase 2, expand. Weeks 5 through 10, deploy to additional business units while continuing to improve governance in the broader environment. This is where momentum matters architecturally. By week 10, 94% of orphaned sites had documented owners and sensitivity labels applied. The governance work that was running in the background had produced results. The organization now had evidence that governance was improving in parallel with deployment, not being constrained by deployment, accelerated by it. Security and compliance teams could see the governance posture strengthening, not weakening, not stagnant, strengthening. This visibility is what shifts security teams from blocking to enabling. The organization expanded Copilot to additional business units, not all, but more than the pilot. Additional departments began seeing productivity gains. Additional teams began adopting. The organization generated internal champions, users who had adopted Copilot, who understood its value, who could evangelize it to colleagues. Phase 3, operate. Weeks 11 onward. Copilot is available organization-wide. This is not the end of the sequence. It is the transition from deployment to operations. But governance does not stop. It shifts. Instead of running remediation projects, SAM policies run continuously. Every month, they detect new orphaned sites. They identify them. They assign interim stewards. They enforce policies. The organization doesn't remediate these sites once and declare success. The organization manages them systematically, continuously. Purview policies continue to run. New documents are classified automatically. New data patterns trigger new labels. The organization's classification posture continues to improve, not because of a massive remediation project, but because the system enforces classification on every document written from that moment forward. Insider risk policies monitor Copilot interactions. Unusual patterns trigger alerts. The organization doesn't wait for security incidents. They detect potential issues early. The organization has shifted from deploying Copilot to operating Copilot. Governance is no longer a project. It is continuous. It is operational, moving between phases. The sequencing is not based on arbitrary timelines. Each phase builds on evidence from the previous one. The organization does not move to expand until pilot metrics are positive. They do not move to operate until governance metrics support it. This is evidence-based progression, not hope, not aspiration, evidence. The case study organization set explicit criteria for phase advancement. Adoption rate exceeds 70%. Sensitivity label coverage exceeds 85%. Orphaned site remediation exceeds 90%. No security incidents. Productivity gains are measurable. Meet these criteria, advance. Miss them, investigate. This removes subjectivity from the process. Decisions are based on data, not opinions, not organizational politics. Data. This sequencing approach is fundamentally different from the gate model. Gates require everything to be perfect before proceeding. Sequencing requires evidence that conditions support moving forward. Evidence of what's actually happening, not perfection, progress. The organization progressed through all three phases because at each phase transition, evidence supported advancing. They never paused, they never deferred, they moved forward with confidence because the data justified it. Metrics and decision points, when to move forward. The parallel track approach requires clear metrics and decision points to determine when to move from one phase to the next. These are not arbitrary thresholds, these are not opinions, these are measurable outcomes based on governance and adoption data. Without explicit metrics, phase advancement becomes subjective. Someone's opinion about readiness, someone's gut feeling about risk, someone's organizational politics about timing. Subjectivity is how deployments stall. Organizations debate whether conditions are adequate. They extend pilots indefinitely. They delay expansion waiting for perfect conditions that never arrive. Explicit metrics eliminate this debate. The data either supports advancing or it does not. Simple as that. Phase 1 exit criteria. The transition from pilot to expand requires meeting specific thresholds. These are the criteria the case study organization established. Adoption rate in pilot units exceeds 70%, measured as weekly active users. Not total licensed users, weekly active users. The distinction matters. You can license Copilot to everyone. Not everyone will use it. Weekly active adoption measures actual engagement. If 70% of pilot users are actively using Copilot every week, the technology is gaining traction. If adoption is below 50%, something is wrong. Training is inadequate. Integration is broken. User expectations are unmet. The organization needs to investigate before expanding. Sensitivity label coverage exceeds 85%. Measured as percentage of documents with labels. This indicates the classification infrastructure is working. Auto-labeling is functioning. The organization is achieving systematic classification, not relying on user choice. 85% coverage means the organization has high confidence that sensitive data is identified and protected. Orphaned site remediation rate exceeds 80%, measured as percentage of sites with documented owners. This indicates governance policies are functioning. Sites have owners. Accountability exists. The organization can expand Copilot knowing that governance is improving, not deteriorating. No security incidents related to Copilot usage. This is binary. Either incidents occurred or they did not. If Copilot interactions triggered data leaks or unauthorized access or compliance violations, expansion is premature. Investigation is required. If no incidents occurred, the security posture is holding. Productivity gains are measurable and positive. Minimum 15 minutes per user per day. This ensures the technology is delivering value. If users are spending time with Copilot but not gaining productivity, the business case is weak. But if they're recovering 15 minutes daily or more, the ROI becomes visible. The technology works. In the case study, all these criteria were met by week 4. Phase 2 exit criteria. The transition from expand to operate requires additional thresholds. Adoption rate across all deployed units exceeds 60%, lower than the pilot threshold because you're now measuring a broader population. Pilots attract early adopters. Broader deployment includes skeptics. 60% adoption across all units indicates the organization is moving beyond evangelists toward mainstream adoption. Sensitivity label coverage exceeds 90%, higher than phase 1. This indicates the organization is maturing its classification approach. Most data is now labeled. The infrastructure has reached scale and reliability. Orphaned site remediation rate exceeds 90%, higher than phase 1. The governance work has matured. 90% of sites now have documented owners. The organization has moved from crisis response to normal governance operations. No critical security incidents. The threshold shifts from any incident to critical incidents. Minor issues may occur, but nothing that threatens organizational security, nothing that would halt deployment. This distinction reflects maturity. You tolerate minor issues in operating systems. You prevent critical ones. Productivity gains are sustained across all deployed units, not initial gains, sustained gains. Users continue using Copilot weeks after launch. Usage doesn't spike and then decline. This indicates adoption is real, not novelty. In the case study, these criteria were met by week 10. The principle. These metrics are not arbitrary. They are based on industry benchmarks and the organization's risk tolerance. An organization with higher risk tolerance might move forward with lower thresholds. An organization with lower risk tolerance might set higher bars. The key principle is that metrics are established before deployment, not during, not after, before. This removes subjectivity from the process. Decisions are based on evidence, not opinions. You establish criteria. You measure outcomes. You compare. You decide. Data drives the decision. The metrics also serve as early warning signals. If adoption is below 50% after 4 weeks, training might be inadequate. If label coverage is below 70%, the classification infrastructure might have gaps. If remediation rate is below 70%, governance policies might need adjustment. The organization can then address these issues before expanding. Course correct early, prevent downstream problems. This is sequential deployment done correctly. Building the business case, ROI, risk reduction, and competitive advantage. The parallel track approach is not just a technical strategy, it is a business strategy, and this distinction matters when you're pitching it to leadership. Organizations that successfully execute parallel governance capture 3 types of value simultaneously. ROI, risk reduction, competitive advantage. These are not theoretical. These are business outcomes that executives understand and care about. Start with ROI. Microsoft's research suggests Copilot delivers approximately $3.70 of productivity value for every dollar invested. Whether that exact ratio holds for your organization is less important than the principle. Copilot creates measurable value. The question is whether you capture that value now or defer it. The case study organization measured this directly in their pilot. 26 minutes of daily time savings per user. That's not theoretical modeling. That's what they observed. Actual users, actual tasks, actual time recovered. At a fully loaded labor cost of $75 per hour, those 26 minutes equal approximately $18,000 in annual productivity value per user. For the 1,200 pilot users, that's $21.6 million annually. Copilot licensing costs $30 per user per month. For 1,200 users, that's $432,000 annually. The ROI is approximately 50-1 in the first year. This is not aspirational. This is the business case. Now think about what happens if you defer deployment. Every month of delay costs approximately $1.8 million in deferred productivity value for a 1,200 person organization. 6 months of delay, $10.8 million in opportunity cost. That number is not recovered. It is simply gone. This is how you move CFOs from why are we spending money on this to why aren't we deploying this faster? But ROI alone is incomplete. It assumes the deployment succeeds and governance doesn't collapse. The second value proposition is risk reduction. Organizations waiting for perfect governance before enabling Copilot assume that deferring deployment reduces risk. In reality, the opposite is true. Organizations that wait for perfect governance continue to operate with orphaned sites, unclassified data, and unmanaged access. These risks compound. Every month that passes without automated governance controls, additional orphaned sites are created. Additional data goes unclassified. Additional permission drift accumulates.
The risk posture doesn't stay the same.
It deteriorates. Organizations that deploy with parallel governance improve their risk posture in real time. SAM policies run continuously. Governance improves measurably. By the time full deployment occurs, governance has improved significantly. And this is lower risk than waiting for perfect governance while the organization's governance posture deteriorates in the background. This reframes risk for executives, not as we're taking on new risk by deploying Copilot, but as we're reducing existing risk by deploying Copilot with systematic governance. The case study organization achieved 94% remediation of orphaned sites in 10 weeks. An organization that chose to defer deployment would have worse governance at month 6 than the case study organization had at week 10. That's the cost of waiting. Increased risk, not decreased. The third value proposition is competitive advantage. Organizations that deploy Copilot early gain competitive advantage. They capture productivity gains before competitors. They learn how to use Copilot effectively. They build organizational capability in AI-driven productivity. Organizations that wait for perfect governance cede this advantage. Competitors deploy. Competitors learn. Competitors build capability. By the time a delayed organization catches up, the competitive gap has widened. In a rapidly evolving technology landscape, first-mover advantage is significant. It is not permanent, but it is valuable. Your organization either captures it now or watches competitors capture it. The business case for parallel governance is not primarily about risk management. It is about capturing value and competitive advantage while governance improves in parallel. This is why C-suite executives should understand and support the parallel track approach. It is not a technical recommendation, it is a business recommendation. Deploy now, improve governance continuously, capture value, reduce risk, build competitive capability. The organization that understands this moves faster. Organizations that don't understand it wait. And waiting is a choice that compounds regret. Common objections and how to address them. Several common objections surface when organizations consider the parallel track approach. These are not stupid objections. They are reasonable concerns rooted in past experiences and legitimate risk awareness. But they are objections based on misunderstandings about what parallel governance actually is and how it functions. Addressing them requires clear communication about the approach itself. Objection 1. We do not have time for parallel remediation. This objection misunderstands the fundamental mechanics of the parallel track model. Organizations think they must choose between remediation and deployment. Fix everything first, then deploy, or deploy now and deal with chaos later. The parallel track approach is neither. Remediation happens during deployment, not before it, not instead of it. During it, the organization does not need to choose between remediation and deployment. They do both simultaneously. In fact, parallel remediation is faster than sequential remediation, not slower, faster. The case study organization achieved 94% remediation in 10 weeks. An organization pursuing sequential remediation would require 6 months or longer. Why? Deployment pressure accelerates governance work. Urgency becomes a force multiplier. Teams suddenly resource governance improvements when Copilot deployment is scheduled. They deprioritize when deployment is deferred. Objection 2. Our security team will never approve this. This objection is usually rooted in a misunderstanding of how Copilot works or what governance controls are in place. Security teams fear that parallel deployment means launching a risky system without guardrails. But the parallel track approach includes specific governance controls before deployment. SAM policies, purview classification, DLP policies, insider risk monitoring, these are not added after the fact. They are operational before Copilot users gain access. The key is involving security teams early and demonstrating that governance is improving in real time. Not hypothetically improving, actually improving. Show measurable progress on governance metrics. 94% of orphaned sites now have owners. 85% of documents are classified. DLP policies are active. By showing tangible progress, security teams see that the approach is working. They move from blocking to enabling. Objection 3. We have tried parallel approaches before and they did not work. This objection reflects past experiences with poorly executed initiatives. The key difference with the parallel track approach is automation. Governance is not enforced through exhortation, it is enforced through policy. SAM and Purview policies run continuously. They do not depend on human effort. They do not depend on organizational discipline. They do not depend on people remembering to do the right thing. Machines enforce policy. Humans respond to enforcement. When you structure it that way, the approach works at scale. Previous parallel initiatives may have failed because they relied on manual processes. This one succeeds because it relies on automated enforcement. Objection 4. We need perfect data before we can deploy Copilot. This objection reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of readiness. Ready does not mean perfect. Ready means governance is systematic, measurable, and improving. Perfect data is impossible. There will always be unclassified documents. There will always be orphaned sites. There will always be access issues. The question is not whether imperfection exists. The question is whether you have mechanisms to detect and remediate it. The parallel track approach answers affirmatively. Governance mechanisms are in place. SAM is running. Purview is scanning. DLP is enforcing. The organization has mechanisms to manage risk while deployment proceeds. Objection 5. This approach is too risky. This objection comes from risk-averse organizations that view delay as safety. But delay is not safe. Delay compounds governance debt. Delay defers value. Delay allows risk to accumulate. The parallel track approach is actually lower risk. It improves governance posture in real time. Organizations that deploy with parallel governance have better governance at deployment than organizations that delay for 6 months while governance deteriorates in the background. Addressing these objections requires clarity, not reassurance. Clarity about what the approach is, how it works, and why it is more effective than the alternatives. When organizations understand the mechanics, the objections usually resolve themselves. Beyond Copilot, applying parallel governance to other cloud initiatives. The parallel track approach is not specific to Copilot. This matters architecturally because it means the principle is not dependent on one technology. It is a governance principle. Generalize it. Organizations can apply this same approach to Power Platform adoption. Power Platform requires governance controls. Data governance, environment governance, app governance, shadow IT governance. Instead of waiting for perfect Power Platform governance before expanding adoption, organizations deploy while improving governance. The principle is identical. Apply it to Teams migration. Teams migration requires similar governance controls. Data classification, access management, channel governance, ownership policies. Instead of waiting for perfect Teams governance during migration, organizations migrate while improving governance. The mechanics are the same. Apply it to cloud data migration. Data migration requires governance and compliance controls. Data residency, encryption, retention, access policies. Instead of waiting for perfect controls before migrating data, organizations migrate while improving controls. The architecture is parallel. The core principle is invariant. Governance is the track. Deployment runs on that track. This is not a Copilot principle. This is a cloud governance principle. Organizations can apply this approach to any initiative requiring governance improvements. The pattern is first identify the automation layer. What tools enforce governance? What policies run continuously? What mechanisms detect non-compliance? For Copilot, those tools are SAM and Purview. For other initiatives, different tools, but the architecture is the same. Automated enforcement, continuous operation. Second, establish metrics and decision points. What outcomes must be achieved before expanding? What evidence justifies advancing? For Copilot, we discussed adoption rate and classification coverage. For other initiatives, different metrics. But the principle is identical, data-driven decisions, not opinions. Third, sequence deployment in waves. Start in controlled environments where conditions are favorable. Build momentum. Expand as evidence supports it. This is not unique to Copilot. This is how you manage risk in any deployment at scale. Organizations that master this approach gain substantial competitive advantage. They deploy technology faster than competitors. They improve governance while competitors debate whether conditions are adequate. They build organizational capability while competitors wait for perfect conditions. This is the essence of modern cloud governance, not preventing change, managing change intelligently, not treating governance as a constraint on innovation, treating governance as an enabler of innovation. The traditional governance model views governance and innovation as opposing forces. You can have safe systems or fast innovation, but not both. You choose. This creates false dichotomies that slow organizations. The parallel track model rejects that dichotomy. When governance is the track, innovation moves safely and quickly. The track carries the train. The train does not wait for a perfect track. The track improves as the train runs. Both move together. Organizations that understand this principle will lead their industries. Not because they are smarter, but because they are faster. They capture value while governance improves. They build capability while competitors debate. They move safely because governance is systematic and continuous, not episodic and gate-like. The future of governance: track, not gate. The core message is simple but powerful. Organizations waiting for perfect governance before enabling Copilot are solving the wrong problem. The real challenge is not to eliminate imperfection. It is to build governance systems that operate while the platform evolves. Governance is not a gate that stops progress until conditions are perfect. Governance is the track that allows progress to move safely. When governance and deployment move together, organizations move from not ready to ready enough. The case study organization did not have perfect governance when they deployed Copilot. They had systematic governance that was improving in real time. By accepting ready enough instead of waiting for perfect, they captured $21.6 million in annual productivity gains while improving their governance posture by 94%. This is the future of governance, not preventing innovation. Engineering systems that allow innovation to move safely. Organizations that understand this principle will lead their industries. Organizations that wait for perfect conditions will fall behind. The question for your organization is not, are we ready? The question is, do we have mechanisms to manage risk while we deploy? If the answer is yes, move forward. Governance will improve along the way. If the answer is no, build those mechanisms now, not as a prerequisite to deployment, as the foundation that enables deployment. If this episode helped you rethink how Copilot governance should work, please leave a review for the M365 FM podcast. Your feedback helps other IT professionals and architects find content that matters. Share this episode with a colleague responsible for Microsoft 365 governance or cloud adoption. The conversation about parallel governance is just beginning. Your peers need to hear this perspective. If you want to continue the conversation, connect with Mirko Peters on LinkedIn. Mirko is actively exploring the next topics for the podcast. Your input shapes the direction of this show. The future of governance is not about slowing innovation. It is about engineering systems that allow innovation to move safely. That is what this podcast is about, turning complex technology into real business value through intelligent architecture and continuous governance. Thank you for listening to the M365 FM podcast. We will see you next episode.